I'd like to now introduce Tom Wheeler, who was our liaison for this presentation tonight.
So this is the combined Library and Scholars Guild presentation. We've been blessed to have Marisa here previously, and now we're joining forces with the Scholars Guild. She's a New York Times bestselling author of Love Walked In, Belong to Me, Falling Together, The Precious One, and her novel, which continues with characters from the first two, I'll Be Your Blue Sky. For this collaboration between the Library and Scholars Guilds, the author will be reading from her book, Watch Us Shine, and provide insights in the process of writing itself. How does she come up with ideas, develop characters? How does a plot emerge from the characters? What are the pleasures and challenges of writing a series? Conversation with the audience is encouraged. Ask away. What questions do you have about writing, editing, or the publishing process? How about life-work balance? Mr. Santos will speak to her personal writer's journey and really anything else the audience would like to ask. She will end the evening with a book signing. While Mr. Santos began her writing career as a poet, she switched to fiction with the publication of Love Walked In, 2005, her first novel, in what would become the Cornelia Brown series. She's gone on to write 6 more novels for the adults, including several New York Times bestsellers, and has co-authored with her husband, David Tigg, who is kind of how I got into this, knowing David from violin class, believe it or not. 2 books for middle school readers. And my wife would like to see the next one written, but I'm heard that's not really in process. She procrastinates with jigsaw puzzles, New York Times word games, and UK detective shows. She's an avid hiker and runner and novice gardener. She lives in Wilmington with her family and their 2 Yorkies. Please give an ardent welcome to Marisa de los Santos.
Paying attention. Okay. Hi, thank you so much for having me. I was trying to remember when I've been here before, and I think twice, I want to say. I think once I came and my daughter, who is now 21, was pretty young, and we had dinner here, which was very nice. We had dinner with the community, and my son was here too. And then I think much more recently, like maybe, I don't know if it was the last book or I'll Be Your Blue Sky, I was here also. So it's always a good time. There are always good questions. And I'm much happier having conversations than doing presentations, but I can do whatever you want. I am told that unlike some groups of people who I speak before, you like to hear a little bit of reading from the book. And some people really don't have a lot of patience for listening to something like that. So I thought what I would do is read a little bit and then talk a little bit about process and about writing a series, which is something I had never, ever thought I would do and have not really done on purpose. And then I would just open the floor to any kind of questions that you might have. I do want to remind people, and if any of you have read this book, that we need to assume that many people have not read the book. So that's always hard for me. So I know it's hard when you've read it, not to include spoilers in your remarks, but we're really going to try not to do that. I did bring a few books to sell, and I think it would just be $15 for the hardcover and $10 for the trade paperback, and then $5 for the little paperbacks. I didn't have any. Love Walked In is a different publisher, and it's I haven't worked with them since Love Walked In, so it's sometimes harder for me to get copies to bring. But the other two books in the series, Belong to Me and I'll Be Your Blue Sky, are here in addition to the newest book. And I'm also happy to sign books or, you know, body parts or whatever you want me to sign. I've never actually been asked to do that, but this book is told in two voices. Most of my books are told in at least two, not necessarily two voices, but from two perspectives. These characters, not all of them, but some of them have shown up in the books Love Walked In, which was my first novel, and which feels like a really long time ago. Belong to Me was my second novel that continued with some of those characters. The third book in my mind in this series is called I'll Be Your Blue Sky. There is some debate about whether there are in fact only three or whether there are four, because I'll Be Your Blue Sky, the first two books, my character Cornelia Brown, who is a main character in the newest book, is also a main character. She has her own chapter, she has her own voice. Cornelia is a character who first kind of popped into my head as pure voice, not really with a story or any other pieces, but a voice and a certain kind of perspective and looking at things, and then developed into a character. So her chapters are always first person. But in I'll Be Your Blue Sky, this character Claire, who is one of the main characters in Love Walked In, but is a child in Love Walked In, is 11, is now an adult and is the main character in there. So Cornelia makes an appearance in that, but to my mind, they're all connected because a lot of the same characters are in them. And then every book in the series introduces new characters. So this one goes back and forth between perspectives, but also between time periods. So Cornelia is in the first person. She's telling her story in her voice, and she is present day. And then something that happens at the beginning of this book is that Cornelia's mother is injured. And Cornelia travels to Virginia, where she grew up, where her parents live, to help care for her mother. And this book goes back and forth between Cornelia in present day and her mother, who is called Ellie in present day, but Eleanor in the past. We see Eleanor when she is late teens into her early to mid 20s in the back. Those are told in third person, so not in Ellie's voice, but from a very narrow perspective, which is really just her perspective, but a third person narration. So what I thought I would do is read just a little bit, just a few pages of the beginning of the first Cornelia chapter, and then a few pages of the beginning of the Eleanor chapters, which are taking place in the 60s. Does that seem okay with you? If you're really getting bored after the Cornelia one and you don't want to hear any more reading, just tell me and we can move on from that. Okay, let's start with Cornelia. My mother is a garden. My father is a street overlaid with gold on that day in fall when all the ginkgos drop their leaves at once. My husband, Teo, is a salt marsh soaked in dawn, and the Blue Ridge from a distance, and our backyard, and the star-riddled night sky in the desert. My stepson, Dev, is a shining creek running through woods. My friend Viviana is a rooftop museum cafe. Her daughter, my almost daughter, Claire, is a meadow, bee-balm starred, fringed with goldenrod, milkweed floss skirting the grass tips like ghosts. My sister Ollie is a laboratory gleaming. My brothers are both beaches in July. My friend Piper is a kitchen, immaculate, with white cabinets, white marble countertops, and oversized appliances that beam like the moon. My children. Oh, my children, Rose and Simon. My children are everywhere I am, or have ever been, or have ever dreamed of going. When I was a kid, I assumed everyone's brain did this nifty trick, conflating people with places. And then in fourth grade, in the middle of class, in a preamble to answering God only knows what question, I piped up, you know how people are places and when you're with them, it's like you're in the place, or, you go to the place and the place is them? And then paused before continuing to look expectantly at my fellow 9-year-olds, only to find that they did not, in fact, know and could not even imagine, and thus learned that the people place thing is my own little weirdness. Like most of my weirdnesses, I can't help it. It's reflexive, immediate, more synesthesia than simile. When I hear my brother's name, Cam, I picture his face, yes, hear his big sunburst laugh, laughing, usually at me, but also a little window in my brain opens out on yellow sand, blooming with umbrellas, white lifeguard stands, dipping, looping kites, the ocean green as a bottle. My mother is a garden. A mild Upper South garden where butterflies clap their wings in the lavender. You can picture it, I know you can. Clouds of asters, riots of roses, shaggy peonies staked into perfect posture, espaliered magnolia against the garage wall, delphinium spires, the blue of which, well, you know that blue, don't you? The one that makes you want to climb inside it and live out all your days. In the garden that is my mother, there is always a trellis strung with morning glories. There is always a mockingbird in a tree. What my mother, Ellie Brown, is not in the slightest bit, is a place where you could plant your boots on snow crust or a frozen lake, tip your head in its tasseled and probably also ear-flapped hat back and watch the northern lights. I am not entirely sure where those places are, except for very far away. Iceland, Finland, Lapland. I'm not even sure if the northern lights are something you watch or merely look at. Do they waver and ripple or just stand still and shine? But I do know that she has nothing to do with any of it, with snowfields or ice flows, with fjords or reindeer or auroras, with any place where people believe in elves. In the garden that is my mother, there are 4 equally undramatic seasons. And I can see how you might think this all sounds a tad crazy, but I swear if you met her within 5 minutes of meeting her, 2 minutes, you'd know exactly what I mean. But there she was in her hospital bed in the rehab center, just out of a physical therapy session with her spindly hands. Never had I thought of them as spindly before, but now they were. Kneading the edge of the quilt we'd brought from home, light from the westward-facing window, illuminating the tears, spilling down her tired face, tired in that taut, wasted, frightened way it always looked after a long physical therapy session, her eyes sunstruck with grief and staring straight into mine, pleading, "Bring me the northern lights. Would you please, Cornelia, bring them to me? I can't believe I left them." And because none of this, not the request or the halting, blurred edge voice she gave it in, not the exhaustion or the crying or the regret or the worrying hands or the northern lights, had a single thing to do with the mother I had known for my entire life up until the past 8 weeks. I too behaved in a way I never had before, at least never toward her. I got down on my knees beside the bed, gently unlatched my mother's fingers from the quilt, kissed her hands, pressed them between my own, and said, "Tell me how." She was my mother, and she wanted the northern lights. I was her daughter and would have given her anything. So that's Cornelia. After that, she finds that her mother was hit by a car. And her recovery is quite intensive. And while she's recovering, when she's, there's something happening with her that is sometimes called sundowning, not a technical term, but where she is more or less coherent and cognitively with it during the day. And then toward the end of the day, she starts to kind of detach from reality. And this is when she's asking for the Northern Lights. Cornelia makes it her purpose after this to figure out what her mother is talking about, and to go in search of the woman her mother used to be before her children were born. If you have read Love Walked In, has anyone read Love Walked In here? We get a tiny piece of story about Cornelia's mother. And that story is that she had a mentally ill mother who was abusive, and that she's basically shut the door on that whole part of her life and doesn't talk about it. And there's a moment when she is kind of pushed to talk about it, says, talks for maybe 10 minutes and then shuts the door again. And so Cornelia doesn't, she really knows very little about her mother's life until, she was born, really, until that time. So what we're going to get next is Eleanor, who is Ellie Brown. She was Eleanor Campbell in 1964, and this is in September. And as I said, this is not told in her voice. It's told in a third person, but a narrow third person, so only her perspective. Eleanor looked up from her book, and there she was, Martha, walking toward her, still so far away that Eleanor could not make out her features or which of her few dresses she was wearing. For most people, a figure at that distance could have been anyone, but for Eleanor, instantly and unquestionably, it was Martha. The span and set of her shoulders, her rangy beeline gait, the particular way she displaced light and cut through space. And as she approached, what always happened. Everything else fell back a little, diminished. Even here, marveled Eleanor, even here on her sunlit campus with its columns and patterned brick walkways, its lush old hardwoods and lacquer-leaved magnolias, and everywhere walking or sprawled on the grass, the lithe and lucky. Boys with their short shirt collars open, girls dressed as if it were the 1950s and not the 1960s, pedal pushers and twin sets, the cardigans discarded in the late September sun, tied loosely around still tanned shoulders or littering the ground along with book bags and school books. It's like being in love, thought Eleanor, like in movies and poetry. The beloved appears and the rest of the world fades. Eleanor did not know if she'd ever find love like that. Wasn't even sure she wanted to. All the high drama and upheaval and pounding hearts and staying up late, pining. The very thought of pining made her impatient. The boys she knew seemed trivial, sweet, loud, and puppy-like, and although she knew she might see them differently one day, she also knew that as she watched her sister walk toward her so far, and for as long as she could remember, this was her truest, her only love story. And so it was that all the elegant geometry of academia, the great billows of emerald grass, her schoolmates resting lightly and shimmering inside their youth and beauty, all of it dimmed as Martha marched up, plain features and heavy brows, awkward and staring straight ahead, all angles in the old green dress Eleanor had made for her. Even across the distance, Eleanor read nervousness in Martha's gait, a hitch of tentativeness, and she wondered if Martha's nervousness might mirror her own, that same uncomfortable pang of worlds colliding. But Eleanor knew that if that were the case, if Martha was feeling out of place, she would set her jaw and lift her chin and step with extra certainty. It's what she usually did when she visited Eleanor at school, a display of bravado that made Eleanor proud and also hurt her heart. So Martha's nervousness meant something else, but it didn't matter, not at that moment. What mattered was Martha was there. Martha was here. Eleanor's older sister, Martha, strode closer and closer, her long shadow preceding her. And as quickly as she came, as purposeful her strides, it was not quick enough for Eleanor, who shut her book and stood up to close the gap between them. So that's just a little taste of the past, and of Eleanor's story. That's so pretty. We're hearing music, people on Zoom, coming up through the floorboards. So it's interesting for me to hear this book described as either the third, depending on your perspective, or the fourth book in a series, because the whole idea of series strikes me as not quite, I mean, to me, the word series feels very intentional. You know, you set out to write a series. And that's not what I have ever done. There's very little, there's a lot that's intentional about my writing. I love playing with words. I love choosing the right words. I spend a lot of time on pacing and, you know, all the usual things, and characters. Character is the thing that matters, I think, most to me, more than any other part of a novel. So I work hard at that, but the thing that isn't intentional is what I write, like what I get to write about, the stories that I have to tell. So when I wrote Love Walked In, it was really just for fun. It was just me. I think my daughter was a year old. I had mainly been a poet. My first book was a collection of poetry. I published a lot of poems in literary magazines, and had studied exclusively with poets in, you know, undergrad, grad school. And so that's what I did. And then at some point, I started to hear this voice in my head. Wasn't my voice. I wasn't going crazy. I was crazier. I'm pretty sure. It was just something that happened where I had this idea, this voice, and the voice would just kind of say things and comment on what was happening around me. And it interested me. Like, it was an interesting voice to me. I lived with it and just kind of, well, that's that. I mean, I was a poet, so it wasn't that weird for me to hear stuff, you know, in my head. I think poetry is a very, it foregrounds, it's a kind of writing that foregrounds music. A lot of writing is musical, but poetry, music is a big part of the point. So hearing words and how the music they make when they bump up against each other, that's something that's kind of always in my head. So hearing a voice was, it might be weird for some of you in the audience to suddenly hear a voice, but it wasn't as weird for me, but it was definitely a departure. I did not write fiction. I didn't particularly write narrative poetry or character-based poems, and not, you know, a lot of monologues and stuff. So it was interesting. I lived with it. And then a character started to form, and Cornelia had a family, and she had a history, and she had a personality and things that she loved, like old movies and vintage shops. And she lived in Philadelphia. She was a manager of a coffee bar. She had a sister and two brothers, and parents who lived in Virginia, where she'd grown up. So I started to know things about her, and then parts of her story started to emerge. And then the second character emerged, who is this 11-year-old girl named Claire. And Love Walked In goes back and forth between those two voices. I started writing Love Walked In for fun. I had no idea that it would ever be a real book. I don't even know if I thought I would finish it. I remember at some point, maybe I'd been up there, you know, at some point I was just like, I may as well just see what this story is. I'm just going to start writing it down. And I went upstairs in my office on the third floor of my house, and I started doing that. But I didn't have a name for what I was doing. And I just, you know, I don't think I could have said to myself, I'm writing a novel, for a while, because that was very scary to me, you know. I mean, I think I was a poet for a lot of reasons. I think it has to do with my relationship with language, but I also think it's because at least my poems were pretty short. And I had kind of, and when I was in grad school and I had to write a 30-page paper, it was like brain apocalypse. I mean, it was just, completely freaking out at the sheer length. So the idea of writing 300, 400 manuscript pages was just not, I couldn't internalize that at the time. But I remember finally coming down and being ready to say it and saying to my husband, okay, so I think I'm writing a novel. And he was like, well, I could have told, like, what did you think you were doing? Like, I could have told you that. I knew you were writing a novel. And I said, yeah, but I didn't know that. I didn't know what it was going to be. When Love Walked In came out, obviously I was an unknown writer, right? The way publishing works is when your manuscript is finally ready and they're going to put it in the pipeline, from that moment until it comes out is often a year, sometimes longer, sometimes a little shorter, but roughly a year between accepting the manuscript and publication of the manuscript. And the publishing house does a lot of stuff within that year in terms of publicity and marketing and business stuff. So generally writers are pretty far into their next project before their first project comes out. So my next project was another book with Cornelia Brown as the main character. She's moved to the suburbs. She's not in Philadelphia anymore. She's married. And other characters, there's a character named Piper, another character, a boy named Dev. And it's, but the thing about that is that it doesn't make a lot of sense to write a novel that's the sequel to a novel you've written when nobody's read that first novel yet, right? Because if it crashes and burns and everyone hates Cornelia, then you're left with a second book with the same character. So it made no sense, but the fact is I usually, almost always, pretty much always have one idea, and it feels, at the risk of sounding a little out there, it feels very given. Like it feels sort of like, okay, this is the novel that's been given to me to write. I mean, I have friends who have many, many novel ideas, and can kind of pick, they can say, they've been writing one kind of novel and they just say, you know what, I'm really interested. I've just read a really great thriller and I think I could write a thriller. So I'm going to try to think of an idea for a thriller. Or, oh, this book came out and it was a huge seller, so I think I will write a sequel to that book. I mean, that's the way you usually a lot of people do things. And they have, on their laptop, on their screen, they have all these little folders with novel idea 1, novel idea 2. And I have one idea at a time. So this was the idea. And luckily it worked out, right? Belonged to me. The stars lined up for that book. And the stars lined up for the first book. So that when the second book came out, people wanted to read it, which was not a foregone conclusion, but wanted more Cornelia. And then when the third book came out, the second book came out and everybody was kind of clamoring for more Cornelia. Not everybody, that would be nice, but a very small, part of everybody was clamoring for more Cornelia. And I'm getting emails and I'm seeing people at book events and they're like, when are we going to see Cornelia again? That wasn't what I had an idea for. And I wrote a few books in there before I wrote another book. And then it was I'll Be Your Blue Sky, where Cornelia is a pretty tangential character and Claire is really the main event. So, and then after that book, I had no idea if I would ever see Cornelia again. And people would say, well, why don't you just write another book with her and then you can see her again? And I'd say, but that's not really how this works, right? I have one idea, and the idea that followed I'll Be Your Blue Sky was not a Cornelia book. So, but when I did recognize that I would be spending more time with this character, I was really happy. You know, I love finding out who they've been, who they've turned into in the years that have intervened between when I last saw them. My characters feel very real to me and very separate from me, and I miss them when I finish writing. There's always a sort of grieving period for not being in their company. I think it's part of the reason that as much as I loved writing poetry, I think I feel more at home in fiction because it's less lonely. Because writing is very solitary, no matter how you slice it, but spending time with characters and words, as opposed to just spending time with words, was a really rich way to exist. And that is something that I love. And I mean, I love other things about a novel. I love the big wide open space of a novel. I love the immersion. I love writing novels for much the same reason I have always loved reading novels. Novels have always been my first love, because I love being lost in a world, and I love getting to know people who are not me, who are different from me and different from people I know. And so that's what I love about writing, and the experience of being just immersed with this group of people. And so with this book, what really happened is that Cornelia showed up again, right? I mean, she just kind of shows up. And I think part of the reason that people responded, the people who I'm sure there were people out there who I don't hear from who didn't really care for Cornelia, but my readers who've read those books tend to love her for her, different reasons for different people probably, but part of it is her buoyancy. Like, she's a very hopeful, buoyant, sort of loving, open-hearted person, right? And she's funny and quirky and has an interesting way of looking at the world, and intuition into human relationships that, you know, is unexpected. And I think that people like her. They like happy Cornelia, even though in all the books, Cornelia goes through a lot of painful stuff, but she is this kind of upbeat character. In the Cornelia who kind of showed up on the doorstep of my brain one day saying, you know, she had a story, was a different Cornelia. She was, what we find out in this book is that something's happened to her. And I don't want to give too much away, but something has happened that has terrified her, that has, most importantly, I think, shaken her sense of self. Because I think that even though Cornelia was always, in some people's mind, kind of a quirky bird or an outsider or whatever, she always had a lot of fun being Cornelia, and she always had a deep sense of self. In this book, this Cornelia, she doesn't know who she is really, and something's happened to her that makes her feel like she's failed her family, like she's put her family in danger, like she's failed as a parent, and so she was tired. You know, the Cornelia who showed up was sad. She was tired. She was lost, and she was kind of drained of a lot of her Cornelia-ness. And so when I saw her, you know, I opened the door and there she was. I thought, oh, okay, I need to do something about this. Like I need to figure out this story, and Cornelia cannot, I need to help her find herself again, right? And come into her sense of self again. So that's kind of how this book got started. And I don't think it gives too much away. It does give some stuff away, but to say that knowing her, and Cornelia's good at many things and she's interesting, but what is most part of her identity, and her sister Ollie even says something to her. She's like, your people are really your vocation. Like that's like, you're really good at loving people and you're really good at taking care of them. And so I think as I was writing this story, because the story comes out of Cornelia, and I knew as she shows up like this, I'm like, oh, something must have happened to her family. There must be something that has shaken her sense of being this person who is good at loving people and taking care of them. So that's what happened. And then there's a sort of a 1-2 punch. Then her mother, right, as Cornelia is sort of adjusting to, not very well, but she's kind of coming out of this fog of this terrible thing happening in her family. Then her mother has this problem. And when she goes to take care of her mother, it is because she loves her mother. It is also an escape. You know, she feels like she's living with her family under false pretenses because she's no longer worthy of them, because she's messed up in this way. So she's kind of running toward, but she's also running away. So, and Ellie, she finds, is also running away and has spent decades running away from maybe the first 24 years or so of her life, and has kind of ripped those pages out of her book, and her kids know nothing about really what she's come from or who she was before they were born. So that's how this story works. Cornelia is on this kind of crusade to figure out to bring her mother the Northern Lights, to understand what her mother's asking for when she asks for that, and to try to fill whatever space there is that's sort of shaped like the Northern Lights in her mother's mind. And so we find out Ellie's story, the missing chapters of Ellie's story. And Cornelia and her sister Ollie also, kind of go on this quest to figure that out together. So she's with her. So anyway, that's kind of it. Yes.
I haven't read any books, apologize, but how good are these books?
Yeah.
How good are your books as a standalone book? Could I read this newest one and not have read the other ones and still sort of understand the characters and the situations and whatnot?
Yeah. Yes. So the answer to that is yes, because to me, these books just in the same way that I'm sort of not completely at home with the word series. Part of that is that these books feel very freestanding to me and very different from each other. And there are people who ask me when this book came out, should I read the other books before I read this one? And my answer is really like, it depends on what kind of reader you are, right? If you can completely read this book and know what's going on, and it's a self-contained story. If you're someone who actually loves a series and loves to spend extended time with a character, and you think you would probably want to kind of know them over time, buy this one now and many, many copies, and give them to everyone you know, but start with Love Walked In and read them sequentially, because what happens if you start with this one, some of the surprises in the first two are not going to be surprises to you, because you kind of know how relationships played out and how things, you know a little bit about it. So I'm not really a reader who reads primarily to be surprised, because I am a huge rereader. And mainly my pleasure comes from spending time in the world and with the characters. And if it's a world and if there are characters that are compelling to me and that I you know, I'm deeply interested in, I'm happy to read about them again, even if I know how the story turns out. Having said that, I love plot. I love mysteries and mystery series, and that's my next project, I think, is to write a detective series. And those are, you have to, I mean, it's like going to plot school to read those, because you really have to learn, you know a lot about plot to write those books. But that's not my primary interest. But if it is yours, you might want to go back and start with Love Walked In, but you don't have to. You can read them all out of order. I mean, and Love Walked In came out so long ago that unless you're one of the people who reads Love Walked In, like I've get notes from readers like, well, I read this once a year. You know, I've been reading it since 2006. Unless you're that person, you probably aren't going to remember everything from those. If you're me, I don't have total recall when it comes to books usually. So especially ones that old. But anyway, it kind of depends on what kind of reader, but no, you absolutely don't have to read any other books and you will understand what's going on in this one. Who else has a question? Oh, I think you need a microphone.
No,
Oh.
Sally. Oh, Sally. Sorry.
So it appears that some authors are fantasy writers, some are historic fiction, some are history writers. And it just from what you've said, I haven't read your books either, like Alan, I'm afraid to say, but I do read a lot of novels, and most of what I read is historical fiction.
Okay.
And you've touched on it a little bit because you've gone back to the 1950s with Eleanor. And I've often wondered, when writers are writing about the past, how tricky is it to not see the past with today's cultural lens? And it's what I love about a historical novel is that often it takes you out of today's historical lens and you're seeing things like perhaps slavery or something which is kind of controversial today, but you might be seeing it through the eyes of the people that lived then.
Right.
And you touched on it if you're just in the 1950s, but I think the idea of writing and being able to let go of today's cultural perspective is tricky. And I was just wondering if that's something you've thought about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that often, I think there are kind of two kinds of historical fiction. There's historical fiction. Well, first of all, this isn't the ancient past, right? It's the 60s, actually. So 1964 is when this opens. I was born in 1966, so I don't remember 1964, but that time period is familiar in that I mean, for me, it's not the distant past, right? And it's not, there is some mention of things that are happening outside the small world of Eleanor. So there are some mentions of some like war protests at the big university near her college. There's a little bit about the civil rights movement. Mostly it's people having conversations. It's mostly people embedded in family more than in a historical moment. So I think with this character, I mean, I also sort of feel like because my books, the story comes out of the characters. And my job, I think, is to get them right, to like listen to them, to take my cues from them, to get them right. So Eleanor may not behave like a typical, I mean, I think in many ways she does, but she may not behave quite like a typical 22-year-old in North Carolina in 1964. but she is very specifically herself. So her responses to things, the things she chooses to push back against, the things she chooses not to push back against, the stuff that, I mean, she's also, for instance, and I wish I could find the part in the book, but there's a moment when her friends are all going to an anti-war, rally, and they're just kind of starting, and she's down in North Carolina, and there's an excitement about that, and Eleanor doesn't go. And it's not that she doesn't have an interest, but it's also that they're talking about changing the world. She's probably 19 at this time, and she has come from a chaotic household, where people pulled the shelves out of the refrigerator and, moments of crazy drunkenness. And, she's lived, and her sister was the buffer between her and this chaos. And she's on this college campus, which is like many college campuses, this is sort of little jewel of a place. It's modeled loosely on Davidson College, but it's not Davidson. And she looks out her window and she's like, I know it's wrong to think this, but who would want to, like, this world is so peaceful. It's so different. Like, I just want to be at home in this world right now. Right. So her impulse to go, even though she's tough, she has a lot of moral fiber. She's very, she can be very outspoken about right and wrong. It makes sense for her, in my mind, to be knowing that complacency is not what's really called upon, that she is like, but I'm at peace right now. Like, I'm okay right now. And I'm here in this world, and look at the trees and look at the sky and look at, and I get to read books all the time. And this is kind of just where I just want to be in a bubble, right? Because she's grown up in a bubble, in a secret kind of secret keeping childhood with, terrible things happening. But this is a peaceful bubble, and she wants to stay in it. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like, I have to stay true to character. And some 19-year-olds were marching in the streets, and she was not that person at this time. She becomes more of a marching in the streets person, but right now she's fragile, and she's just protecting herself and grateful to be in this pretty world that's peaceful and full of books and friends, so I don't know if that answers your question, but does anyone else?
I just wanted to hear a little bit about maybe what your literary influences have been. Like, I know that as we, go through decades of our lives, they often change. And so I'd love to hear like kind of what your evolution has been, if that's possible, to talk about, what your literary influences might have been when you were very young and then up to now.
Yeah, I mean, I was a kid who, there are pictures of me reading while roller skating. Like, I was a kid who always had the book on my lap at the dinner table, never stopped reading, and read books over and over until they, I've read them literally to pieces. I have to get new copies. And when I was a kid, I read everything, but there were books that I loved. Anne of Green Gables. I read all of those books over and over again. I loved that kind of small town, lots of characters. I loved Anne. I felt a kinship to her and her imaginative life, her love of reading and language, and that pastoral setting of Prince Edward Island. I loved that. I loved a lot of those classics like Little Women. I mean, when I was really little, I read The Secret Garden over and over again, A Little Princess, and a pretty standard fare, I think, for girls. But there is one writer who I feel, if I had to name a writer who has influenced me as a writer the most, it would be a woman named Elizabeth Enright. Has anyone ever read Elizabeth Enright? So, yeah, what have you?
I know the name. My memory is shot these days. I'm trying to pull it up. I recognize the name Elizabeth Enright,
Yeah.
but I can't pull a title out of it, but I know I've read something
I
of hers.
Won at least a couple, I think a couple of Newberries. There was one called Thimble Summer that was a big one. But and then there were two, there was a series of books about a family called the Melendi family. There's the Saturdays, the 4-Story Mistake. It's really, they're books about a big family. In the Saturdays, they live in New York City, and then they move out to the country. And I think they were written during the second, they're set in like the 30s and 40s. But her writing is just crystal clear and beautiful and musical, and really some of the best prose I think I've ever read in fiction. And just the rhythms. I mean, I think I internalized so much of the way she works. Her mind is like my mind, I think, in that I have a kind of, you know how Cornelia conflates people and places. I have a very associative mind where I kind of see in metaphor and think in metaphor, and instantly when I look at something, it's what, oh, that looks like this other thing, or that, it's very, and Elizabeth Enright has that same kind of mind. Later, I mean, I was an English major, and then I got an MFA, and then I had a PhD. So I just went to school for a really long time, and luckily read books that were out of my comfort zone. One of my best experiences was reading medieval and Anglo-Saxon literature, which was fascinating to me, the way those stories are put together. They're not character driven at all, really. Some Middle Ages are, but Beowulf is not, but the repetition of the language and the portmanteau words, and just a lot of stuff really, I think, influenced me there. But the writers I love, I've loved as an adult I love Anne Patchett. I'll read every single thing she writes. I just read her recent book, Tom Lake, which is beautiful. And like with many of her books, as I'm reading it, I'm like, oh my gosh, you can write books like this. Like you can write books where, Tom Lake is a story, it's set during the pandemic, when this woman and her daughters and her husband are all working on their cherry farm because they're on lockdown together, right? And she's telling them this story, which they've heard in bits and pieces, about when she was briefly in her 20s, an actress, and an affair that she had with this fellow actor who in Summerstock, who later became a famous movie star. And that story has been kind of on the periphery of her daughters' lives and their imaginations, but they've never really heard it. And so she tells it, and that's it. Like, that's kind of the whole story, where she's in this setting, and there's suspense, and she manages suspense, even though that even though bad things happen to this young girl version of the mother, she's going to be okay because she's okay. Like, she's in the present, she's loves her life. So she got there, and that, but even so, you're kind of with her as she goes through these difficulties. So I love Anne Patchett. I love Barbara Kingsolver. I love her language. I love her characters. I love her commitment to environmentalism and feminism and all kinds of things. But I also just think she's a great storyteller. I have read some really good books. Oh, I love Kate Atkinson. And Kate Atkinson has a detective series. Kate Atkinson is very literary, but she has a detective series with a detective named Jackson Brody, and they are such good books. So it's a lot of, I guess, and I love detective fiction, and I'll read any. I love Tana French. I love Anne Cleeves. I love the Thursday Murder Club. Have any of you read that? The newest one came out today. I just started it today. I love a true series where you stay with these characters for so many books. The Inspector Lindley mysteries. I love, that's what we watch. That's what we watch mostly on TV. I mean, we depart from that for something really, really good, like The Bear or something like that. But mostly we watch a lot of detective series. So, I love Middlemarch. I love Austen. There are a lot of women writers, but men too. I think Michael Chabon is a genius. I love this writer named Kent Haroof, who writes kind of about the Midwest. He had his book Plain Song is one of my annual rereads. So does that give you a sense? Any other questions for me?
Are you worried that there is a lot less reading by kids today? And it just seems like with my own grandchildren or younger people that I know, well, some of them who felt like they've never read, they're discovering reading through audiobooks.
Yeah.
But it also just seems that people are so engrossed with television series and television stories and series on televisions that people don't take the time to read. And I wonder if the whole idea of being a bookworm, which you were as a child, kind of does it even exist with kids today? And I wonder if something's being lost with the vast growth of television entertainment.
Right. My kids are 21 and 24. So I don't know a lot of young children. They haven't started having kids. Their generation really hasn't yet. So I can't speak to a 10-year-old today. I will say that when my kids were small, they were obsessed with the Harry Potter books. My daughter has read that series 8, 10 times. I mean, she just finished, start from the beginning, finish, start, and a lot of her friends did too. And they didn't just see the movies, but they read the books, and the books are 900 pages, and they have an encyclopedic knowledge of them. When there's a crossword puzzle question or a trivia question about a particular spell, my daughter's like, oh yeah, that's the blah, she knows it. So I think there are at least back then there were still those kids. I think that kids, my kids weren't maybe the reader that I was, but they read a lot. Partly I think it had, for them and for their friends, it may have had less to do with social media and television and streaming and all of that than it had to do with how busy they were with sports and music. And I did gymnastics pretty seriously, but I had a lot of downtime. I was bored in the summer. My kids are my son was a swimmer. In the summer, he's getting up at 4:30, going to swim. It was there. It was, we didn't really intend for that to happen. It's just kind of how kids live now, where they are very scheduled and very busy. And so I think, and my daughter would be the kid at a swim meet with her book, and a lot of them had those, but I think that's why they aren't as prolific you know, as I was. I just had a lot of downtime. You know, I was also an insomniac, so I would stay up all night reading when I was a kid. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, we all live in our small worlds, and in my small world, there are a lot of readers. A lot of my friends are readers, way more. I mean, I am a weird thing happened to me during the pandemic, and which was that, and I didn't, not from getting sick, just from the weirdness of the world. And maybe the politics of everything that was kind of going on, where the world felt really, really just, I was disoriented in it. I kind of lost some of my concentration. I mean, pandemic, there wasn't a whole lot to do, and I should have been reading and writing like a maniac, and I didn't have the focus for it. And I started listening to audiobooks, and I think they're their own, I think they're reading. I think they're their own kind of pleasure. And there is a beauty to hearing language out loud. You know, I do love, especially with a writer that I love, hearing the language, hearing that music of the language. But you know, are all these novels going to be written by AI from now on? They're not going to need us anymore. I don't know. I mean, technology is crazy and it's distracting. But the children's, like the Times list, there are still children's books that sell like hotcakes, and the kids are lined up at the bookstores to get the next installment of whatever series it was. And I mean, my kids were those kids, you know, what's going to happen next in the Hunger Games, or what's going to happen next in Harry Potter, or and so I think those kids still exist. I don't know how big a chunk of their population they represent.
Can you tell us a little bit about the structure of your time writing, and like when you find yourself writing, and do you, like you were just talking about losing your focus during the pandemic?
Yeah.
So what did it look like before, and what does it look like now?
I am, you know, I try to have structure to my days. Ideally, I want to be a writer who says, no matter what is happening in the world, in my family, in, you know, my community, I write for 5 hours a day and I just shut it all out. But I'm really not that person. So I am a very, like Cornelia, people are, I mean, I am a writer, that's my identity, but the people in my life are my passion and my first commitment. So when I had, you know, a lot of these books that I've written, I wrote with kids living in my house at different stages of, you know, different stages of their lives. And I didn't want to miss anything with them. So I wrote when they were at school. And when they came home from school, I stopped writing. But I also did all the other stuff you have to do in your life, you know, while they were at school. I didn't want to miss the swim meets. I didn't want to miss the lacrosse games. You know, I wanted to be there for it. And so I structured whatever was happening with them, I kind of structured my life. And then evenings and weekends, really, for the most part, belonged to my people, like my kids, but also my friends, you know, and I think I'd be a different kind of writer if that weren't true. You know, I think that I probably would have more books, but they wouldn't be the same books. So now that my kids, you know, my daughter's in her last year of college, my son is 24, we're a really close family, so I text with them every day, but they aren't here. But you know, it kind of like it kind of depends on what's going on. you know, and I tend to write in spurts. And I write, you have those charm days that don't come along very often where you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, it's dark outside and I've been right. But that doesn't happen to me that much. I am a very neurotic kind of writer. So it's very, I can work for 4 hours and have one paragraph. You know, it's just a very, I write fiction the way I wrote poetry. So it's not the right way to write fiction. Like you really should bang out a draft, get the story out there, get it all out, and then go back and work with that raw material. And I don't do that. I really write one sentence, get it to be the way I want it. Then I write the next sentence, and then I, you know, so it's very slow. But life comes first. So that's kind of how I, you know, that's what happens. Yeah.
So this is somebody on Zoom from our Zoom audience and says, hi, I read your first 2 books. I was wondering how much of your own experience you include in your novels.
You know, I think every writer writes out of who they are, right? And what's important to them and what they've lived through and the people they've known. With my books, the closest I've come to any kind of autobiography is in the first book. Claire's mother has bipolar disorder. My mother had bipolar disorder, and the way it manifested, which wasn't violent and wasn't, you know, it was just this, like, there's a scene where Claire's mother goes to the store and buys a certain kind of towel, sets of towels in every single color. And it's just like, aren't they beautiful? Look at this blue. Look at that was my mother did that. But for the most part, it doesn't really come from my life. The character, because I think it's because my stories tend to come out of the characters. The characters come first. I know who they are. I know how they talk. I know what they value and what scares them and what they were for Halloween when they were little. You know, I know all these things about them before I even know their story. And then the story kind of emerges out of who they are. So because of that, it's not really based on my life. And any resemblance, you know, when like I'm thinking of the second book, Belong to Me, is set in the suburbs. It's set actually in a town, a fictional town that's not unlike Wilmington, where I live. And it's people, when that book came out, they're like, oh, I know who this is. I know who Piper is. And I would say, no, you don't, because Piper's Piper, you know. But I think the things I steal from people in my life are little things, like the way somebody talks with their hands, or the nervous habit that they might have, or a phrase that they use wrong every single time, or, you know, some kind of food that they prefer. And so that I just little bits and pieces. But I think that my characters are kind of, it's like when you have kids and everybody wants to say, oh, she looks just like Aunt Lucy. He's, you know, he's a spitting image of this, or that's his temper is just like this. And eventually they just become themselves, and you kind of stop seeing them as in relation to other people and their gene pool. Like my kids just became my kids, right? And I stopped seeing, and people will surprise me still by saying, oh, you look like your daughter looks like you. I'm like, no, she doesn't. Like, she looks so different to me, and is so different, because she's just a full-fledged person. And that's kind of how it is with character. So not a lot is autobiographical, but all of it is informed by me, you know, and who I am and what I've experienced, which is true of every book that any writer writes, I think. Would anyone like to ask? You can ask about anything. You can ask about publishing, whatever you want to do. It really, anyone? My publisher in hardcover is William Morrow. It's a Harper imprint, and then Harper paperback. My first book was Penguin, so it was it was different. And then my editor left and went to Harper, and so I went with her. So that's how I ended up there.
Yes. How did you originally connect with a publisher?
So what happened was as I mentioned, I had this voice in my head. I started writing this book. I was primarily a poet, but I had written a few essays for collections of essays. So editors had asked me, who liked my poetry or who knew me somehow or somehow had some connection, would say, I'm writing, this is a book about nannies. I know you had a nanny when you were writing, when your kids were little. Do you want to write an essay about that? So I wrote an essay about that and I put it in the book. And there was another one about the experience of turning 30 by women who were still in their 30s. So I wrote an essay about that. And the agent for the editor, like if you're editing a collection, you're the one who gets the agent, right? It's your book, your name's on the cover, you get the agent. The agent for one of these books contacted me kind of out of the blue and said, hey, I know I loved your piece in the book. It was my favorite piece. I know you're primarily a poet, but if you ever think of writing something book length and you don't already have an agent, I would love to read it. And of course I didn't have an agent because I was a poet. And, unlike some, out of the monde, there are poets who have a lot of financial success. I was not one of them. So no agent wants 15% of nothing. So I did not have an agent. But so I said, well, look, and I think she was expecting a memoir because the stuff that I'd written were personal essays. And I said, well, I started writing a novel and I have maybe 80 pages. And I could send you that if you want to see it. So I sent it to her. And of course, in the meantime, I'm Googling her. I'm seeing the writers that she's represented. And she was a small and is still in this, she's still my agent. This kind of boutique New York agency. At the time, there were just two partners, Danelle Carlson. It was Danelle Carlson, and then they added Betsy Lerner, so then it was Danelle Carlson Lerner, and now I think they have others. But that was right up my alley. Like I don't think I would have been as happy being represented by William Morris, being represented by some giant agency. I like to know people. And we also, so then she got the pages, she called me a couple days later, and we ended up talking on the phone for hours. And she said, I would love to represent you, and represent this book. So then I was like, okay, I guess it has to become a book. Because it wasn't it was 80 pages. And she said, I think we should meet first though. So I went to New York and I met her, and she's a writer's agent. Like she's often as good an editor as editors that I've had. She's really smart, and she really loves, she's very, she doesn't take on anything that she wouldn't love to read personally, so she's we're still really close friends. She still represents me. So what happened was, when it was a book, I kind of worked with her. Like I would send her chunks and she would give me some feedback, and then I'd send her more chunks. And then finally we thought it was ready to go, and she sent it out. And she's really smart about who she sent to. She really knew the lay of the land, and picked editors who she thought would love it. And many editors loved it. So then it went to auction, which basically means that editors are kind of trying to bid for it. And so it came down to me kind of talking to certain editors and meeting them. And we ended up choosing this editor, Lori Chittenden, who I loved when I talked to. And that was it, really. So it doesn't usually happen that way. I mean, that's a little bit of an unusual story. It was very serendipitous. It often happens where you write a book first, and then you query, like you send query letters to 20 agents, 30, however many it takes. And then someone might say, oh, send me the first 50 pages or send me the book. And then you, and that was not how I got an agent, and my agent's still my agent. So, I didn't go through that process, but, it was luck. It was just very lucky. It was just somebody who read something I'd written that hardly anyone read, and decided, okay, this is a writer who I think we'd make a good, I'd love to represent. And so that's how it went.
So when you get on the New York Times bestseller list, does that happen because of word of mouth, marketing, serendipity? Like because there's a lot of books and I often wouldn't even know, I'm sort of walking through the library, just looking at titles, which might be of interest. And so I'm always kind of intrigued as to how New York Times bestseller lists even work.
They work in all kinds of ways. I mean, there's writers who just live on the list, right? They always have a new book and they just live on the list. I was not one of those writers. Love walked in for an unknown writer in hardcover. It sold well. And that's partly because independent booksellers, so when a publisher sells in, they send galleys. And sometimes you go to like a big thing where there are a whole bunch of publishers and they give away all these galleys and there are all these readers, kind of like big conferences like BEA or something like that. But what happened with Love Walked In is that a lot of indie booksellers just liked it, and they put it in front of store, which, I mean, in publishing, placement is everything, right? It's everything. The thing where, and it's all real estate that's paid for, especially in the big stores, it's kind of paid for. But indies can do what they want. So they can just, and if you go to independent bookstores, they have staff picks, they have newsletters, they have blogs, and so when Love Walked In came out in paperback a year after it came out in hardcover, then it was a New York Times bestseller. And that was just like a slow build. With Belong to Me, which was it debuted at number 5 and got as high as number 4. That was because a very powerful person in publishing who was the book buyer for Barnes & Noble and the book buyer for Borders both chose it for all these special things. So it was like Borders Book Club, and I flew to Ann Arbor maybe and did a whole thing where they recorded it and it was online, and it was a lot of special stuff, special placement, and it was a Barnes & Noble recommends, which is a big thing. I mean, it wasn't Oprah, but short of Oprah, getting chosen for some of those programs was a big deal. Nowadays, the book Borders is closed. Bricks and mortar bookstores are alive, and but they don't have as much impact. I mean, it still matters if you're front of store at Barnes & Noble. Having a book turned out as opposed to being spine out is huge. There are just things like that, just to catch people's eye. A lot of bestsellers now are picks like Today's Show, and, you know, they're picked by Jenna Bush has a book group, you know, there's all these like series that they pick, and there'll be a sticker on the cover. The stickers on the cover sell a lot of books. You get a lot of press. Oprah still has her picks. She picked Demon Copperhead, which is, and then she picked, I think she picked Tom Lake. So sometimes happens that way, but sometimes it is word of mouth, and it is independent booksellers and just people who love books talking to each other. And I know as a reader, what has the most influence with me is if a friend who I know and whose taste I trust says to me, you have to read this, I read it. I buy it, I read it. And even though I do read some, like I get the New York Times, so I read the book reviews that are in the New York Times. I do pay a bit of attention, although sometimes like this National Book Award list, I haven't read any of those books, you know, so, I mean, I might, but I haven't yet. I do pay a bit of attention to that, but nothing has as much influence as my sister calling me and say, okay, I just finished this book, you have to read it. And then I'm like, and she's like, you have to read, and she's very bossy, and very bossy about books. And so she'll say, no, I mean, right now, you have to read it right now. Like, what are you doing? Go buy it. Like, go get it right now. So that's a lot of that still happens. You guys this probably happens for you. Book clubs are a huge way of, you know, getting people to read what they might not ordinarily read. So, yes. Oh.
The sibling interaction in your newest book was interesting, I thought, and very realistic. The brothers and Ollie and your place in it with them, and that interaction I found very
I have
believable.
I have one sister who I grew up with, and yeah, that's kind of it. But I always wanted, I mean, back to those Melendi books, I wanted to be part of a big family. I wanted to have 4 siblings. I wanted to have brothers. I had a lot of friends who felt like family and still do. I mean, I think the lines are very blurred. My kids are not kids who grew up with a ton of cousins, or, you know, but we have a lot of really good friends who are family to us, and their kids are, you know, I mean, but yeah, and the relationships that I have in my family are very, very close. So my kids, my son and daughter, are best friends. They talk every day. You know, they were both in DC this summer, and saw each other all the time. So it's not a big family, but it's a very close and kind of intense family.
Oh, it's very realistic. The banter, I thought, the sibling banter was great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Marisa, thank you so much. Let's give Marisa a big hand.
Thank you.
And as promised, she has copies of her books there, and
Yes, and
we'll
I
sign them.
have a Venmo. If you use Venmo and you want to buy books that way, or if you have cash. I don't have a credit card reader on my phone. I'm a very low tech person in general. So, or if you have a book and you want me to sign, but. Well, I know, and my kids, like he's like, you got to get Venmo and you got to get Uber, Mom. So they. Yes, they're very bossy also. There are a lot of bossy people in my life. Okay, so can I take this? Let me take this off.